Be even better. So, well, good morning. I am so impressed with you guys for getting up out of bed and coming. Because honestly, if I wasn't teaching, I'd probably still be in bed right now. You guys are truly the dedicated ones. So I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. I can't believe it's December already. Hey, good morning. Come on in. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. You got to kind of, I think you just got to pull it out. There you go. I can't believe it's December. Welcome to Advent and Christmas. And it's like, this is the time of year where you think about babies and mangers and angels and peace on earth and goodwill. And I really wish we could talk about that. Unfortunately, we have to talk about blood and gore and massive things. So I really apologize. It was just bad timing that the way the flow of the material worked. So we wrapped up before Thanksgiving talking about the Exodus, and we kind of said, went through the stories. It's kind of a liberation story, an origin story. Maybe, if you watch a lot of superhero movies, they always have the origin stories. How did Superman become Superman, and how did Batman become Batman? Hey, good morning. So that the Exodus is kind of like, how did the Israelites become Israelites? And the next phase of that story in the Bible is the taking or the conquering or the conquest of the land of Canaan. So the books of Joshua is primarily also called the conquest narratives. It's Joshua coming in, taking over from Moses, leading the people into the land. And it is not, it's not Jesus, for sure. It is very bloody and troubling. So, and the bad thing is, you have to, this book, these passages are in the Bible. We need to talk about them. This is honestly the reason I started wanting to do a class, is when I was sitting in my Hebrew Bible class and we got to this part, it was like, oh my God, we need to talk about this, because if you just gloss over it, you can just skip this part of the Old Testament if you want. But the problem is, if you don't think about it and talk about it, you can come up with sometimes very inappropriate theology. You get the impression that this is all God ordained, and throughout history, people have been using these narratives for justification for all sorts of holy wars, conquests. Even in America, it was like, come over and we have to either convert or eradicate the Native Americans, because, and it was all based on the conquest narratives. So, we need to be, I'm a little cautious, when you balance, if we're Christians and we're going to follow Jesus, we have to balance what Jesus taught with also the tradition from where Jesus came from. And so I get very skeptical or concerned about theologies that force people to follow a way of thinking through fear, through intimidation, through the threat of violence or the threat of death. So what I want to do is kind of go through this. I think we can do it in 3 weeks, so I'm going to try really hard. The first section is just an overview of the biblical narrative. Let's just kind of go through quick at a high level, see some of the stories that are in the book of Joshua. What is it actually saying? And then we'll do kind of an overview, since we are talking about archaeology and history. What does the archaeology say about all of this? And we find some very, very interesting things when we go and compare the archaeology to what's actually the stories that are in the Bible. And then the last section, maybe right before Christmas, I'd like to kind of do something different and have a discussion more than a presentation, because I think understanding, having some discussion, and you may have, if this is the first time you've thought about these things, you may have some questions. If you haven't ever, or if you've talked about this in the past, but it's just very relevant. So I want to give it due justice. And then when we're after Christmas, we can move on to happier topics. And actually, they don't get much happier for a while. They don't get happy until Jesus shows up. So, all right. So a couple of things to kind of set the stage before we jump into this. I want to back up to Deuteronomy. So we talked briefly about Deuteronomy. It's just a lot of laws, but it was written, if you remember, around the time of King Josiah. So the Assyrians had come in, obliterated the northern kingdom. King Hezekiah, Josiah's grandfather or father, was trying to do everything he could to try to stop, hold back the Assyrians. And they were successful. The Assyrians did not conquer Judah. But the northern kingdom was gone, and that was like a warning shot across the bow to the Israelites. Like, man, things are changing. The northern kingdom, which was by most counts the more prosperous, bigger, more prosperous kingdom, had been obliterated. So in the time of King Josiah, there was kind of this religious reform movement, and they were looking hard at themselves, saying, what did the northern kingdom do that was wrong and caused them to get obliterated? And why are we not obliterated? And the conclusion they came to was the northern kingdom wasn't worshiping Yahweh properly. They were worshiping at all these shrines. They were offering sacrifices at all these shrines and the high places. And so Josiah was like, no more of that. And so he goes out, and some of these shrines were Yahweh shrines. I mean, they're worshiping kind of cultish things around Yahweh. So it's not necessarily that they were abandoning the Yahwistic religion, but they were mixing it in with religions, because that's kind of what you did back then in those days. Is you're like, oh, my God's Yahweh, but the local God is Asherah, so let's just worship both of them. And then we got all our, it's like being in Vegas, and you kind of put your chips on all the different markers, and so hopefully you're going to win. So Josiah, the priests, quote unquote, find the book of Deuteronomy hiding in the temple. Most scholars think that it was just written then, but they come out to Josiah and say, look at all these things that we haven't been doing. And the book of Deuteronomy really goes down and goes hard against foreign gods. You must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispossess serve their gods on the mountain heights, on the hills, and under every leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles with fire, and hew down the idols of their gods. Very, very strong language. So Josiah embarks on this reform movement, but unfortunately, the Israelites eventually get taken over by the Babylonians. But the underlying message of the Deuteronomy is, unless you remain faithful and obedient to Yahweh and worship in the right way, you will suffer the consequences of disobedience. In other words, it wasn't just enough to have faith or to believe in Yahweh or trust in Yahweh. You had to do all the right things. And if you didn't do the right things, if you sinned, and I'm not necessarily talking about each of us individually sinning or each of the Israelites sinning, they could do, but the nation as a whole, the kings, if the kings and the nations were sinning, not worshiping Yahweh properly, they would get, that would lead to divine punishment. And so basically it's what's called retributional theology, or I like to think of it as sin, rinse, and repeat. And so you do something wrong, God punishes you. You change your ways, God blesses you. Then a few months, years later, you do something wrong, God punishes you. So it's very much, you do the right thing, you're rewarded for it. You do the wrong thing, you're punished for it. You hear a lot of that in the prosperity gospels today. It's kind of toned down. It's not like you're going to get destroyed or whatever, but if you have faith in God and believe God, if you ever watch my friend Joel Osteen or some of the others, God will reward you. And he has big, churches and Learjets and all this stuff. But if you don't follow God, if you don't have enough faith God won't heal you of your sicknesses. If you have cancer, God won't heal you of your cancer because you didn't have enough faith, blah, 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 blah. It all comes out of this Deuteronomistic theology of kind of retribution. Just some more things from Deuteronomy that just, this is God, quote unquote, God speaking. I will heap disasters upon them, spend my arrows against them, wasting hunger, burning consumption, bitter pestilence, horrible things that God is going to do to the people if they don't follow. So that's the book of Deuteronomy. One last little technical thing before we move to Joshua. The books that follow the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, so Deuteronomy is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The next set of books, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is referred to by scholars as the Deuteronomistic history. I will try not to say that too many times because I can't, it's really hard to say it. I'm just probably going to call it the DH or the history, but that's what I'm talking about. And what this is scholars, Martin Knott was a German scholar in the early 1900s. He was the one who put this theory out, and almost all scholars buy into this today, is that those books were patterned after or edited following the book of Deuteronomy as its kind of guiding principle. In fact, a lot of scholars think that the book of Deuteronomy was actually the starting point for this work and contained all of these histories. So the history of Israel has been kind of reinterpreted or retold in the telling of these books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, in light of Deuteronomistic theology. In other words, retribution. And if you've read any of the Old Testament or from those things, you're always hearing about the kings were bad, the kings were good, the king was bad, God blessed them, God brought disease upon them. It's just this constant seesaw, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So what I wanted just to get you in your mind is that we're not necessarily reading what we think of. When I say the history, we're not reading what we think of as history, where a historian trained in history goes in and tries to tell as unbiased of a version of what happened as they can. If we get a book out of the history section in the bookshelf, we're kind of thinking this has gone through some editorial process. There's a lot of research. Who's the guy, Dave, who writes all the books? He wrote Leonardo da Vinci and Isaacson, Walter Isaacson. Walter Isaacson is a great example. He's a professor of history at Tulane. He writes all these things. They're well-researched, well-documented, so you try. That's not what we're talking about here. So when we talk about the Deuteronomistic history, we're talking about a retelling of the history, but from a decidedly slant of following the theology that gets laid out in the book of Deuteronomy. So we just have to kind of keep that in our mind. I think I said just about everything on this slide. Mostly from the southern kingdom, because this was all written after the northern kingdom was destroyed. So the southern kingdom is like seeing this is what they did wrong. We're not going to do that. And you get these kind of things that the characters, the narrator, the person, when you're in a passage where it's not somebody talking, the narrator or the historian will often say, this king was walking in the ways of the Lord. Josiah, Hezekiah, they walked in the way of the Lord. They did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Or the bad kings were wicked in the eyes of the Lord. So they definitely have a slant. Okay, so just a little background information. Let's talk about Joshua, the book of Joshua. So the first thing that happens in the book of Joshua is Joshua gets Mosified. the Mosification. I just made that word up. The spell check, every time I wrote it, the spell check said, no, that's not a word. I don't know if it's a word. But what it is that basically Moses has died, so they need a leader, but that leader needs to be Moses. He needs to be a Moses-like figure and do this. So there's a lot of stories when you look at things that Moses did that Joshua does. So in the book of Numbers, Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan to check it all out. In the book of Joshua, Joshua sends spies into the land of Canaan. Moses goes and parts the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds, to get away from Pharaoh. Joshua does the same thing. He parts the Jordan River to get across and into the land. So in the book of Joshua does he pulls out his best Charlton Heston, parts the water, and all the Israelites walk across the river. Walking across the river is not quite as big a deal as walking across the sea, but you get the picture. Zipporah, we talked about that, where she has to circumcise Moses' son in an emergency because God's attacking Moses. Apparently, the Israelites don't get the message about circumcision because 40 or 50 years later, the whole Israelite army is uncircumcised at this point. So Joshua orders that they all get circumcised, which is not the greatest idea right before you go into battle. I'm just speaking as a guy, but that's what they do. Moses celebrates the Passover. Joshua celebrates the Passover. Moses talks to Yahweh and says, you're standing on holy ground. Take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. God, an angel, not Yahweh, but a divine being, comes to Joshua and tells him to take off his sandals because he's on holy ground. Moses defeats the Egyptians. Joshua defeats the Canaanites. So you can see this they're kind of building him up. They're using this story arc. And this is a very familiar path. If you've been in the class before, and usually around Christmas time, we talk about Matthew's birth narrative, and that's what happens in the birth narrative of Jesus in the book of Matthew, is they do all these things that are very reminiscent of Moses. Matthew is setting Jesus up to be the new Moses. So they're kind of just like casting him into the role so that he becomes the new leader, which is pretty cool. So if you just break the book down, there's about 5 chapters of the Israelites getting ready to go into Israel. Then 6 chapters of blood and gore where they destroy all the Canaanites. And then however many chapters, 8 chapters of apportioning the land and who gets to go where. And there's a whole political debate over which tribes get which land. And then the final closing epilogue where Joshua gives a rousing speech to the Israelites. You may have heard the saying, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. My mom had that on a little plaque in our house growing up. That comes from the book of Joshua. Yep. So let's talk about the text. So this is kind of just the history of the text, and I'm just going to walk through a little bit. And just to say that while we are talking about archaeology and history, like we've talked about before, sometimes we don't have much archaeological evidence and we don't have much historical outside documents, or the documents we have are very scarce. So sometimes the best thing we can do is a close reading of the text that the Bible has given to us and preserved for us, and we kind of have to read it and then kind of slice it apart and maybe read between the lines a little bit to see what they're saying. They say a lot of times the Bible, there's certain topics where the writers of the Bible are just like railing, like worship of Asherah. They just go on and on, years and years. Asherah was a Canaanite goddess, one of the chief gods of the Canaanite religion. People really worshipped her. There was actually an archaeological inscription found where it's like at it was like the Israelite equivalent of a Buc-ee's, where you stop a little way station along the way, and you stop, And they found this engraving on the wall that said, "May Yahweh and his Asherah bless you on your journey." So they were kind of combining these things. And the text rails against the worship of Asherah. Well, why would the text rail against that if nobody was doing it? It's like if nobody's worshiping Asherah, then you wouldn't really have to say much about that. Okay, so Battle of Jericho. So this is, again, there's some parts of the text that I love. Joshua secretly sends two spies to go in, and he says, "Go and check out the region of Jericho." So they set out, and they came to the house of a harlot, a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. Of course they did. Where else would you go? And the king of Jericho was told about this and said, "Some men have come here tonight, Israelites, to spy out the country." And the king knew exactly where they went. So he goes straight to Rahab, and he's like, "Rahab, produce the men who came to you and entered your house, for they have come to spy out the whole country." And Rahab, however, had taken the two men and hidden them. And she says, "It's true, they did come to me, but I didn't know where they were from. And at dark, when the gate was about to be closed, the men left. And I don't know where they went, but if you hurry and go after them, you can probably catch them." So the king and all the soldiers head out the gate and into the wilderness to look for the Israelites. Now, Rahab had taken the Israelite spies up to the roof and hidden them under some stalks of flax, which he had lying on the roof. And the king's soldiers pursued the Israelites, or went out chasing the Israelites, even though they were not outside, they were still in the city. And the spies had not yet gone to sleep when she came up to them on the roof. I wonder why. They were probably preoccupied. And she said to them, "I know that the Lord has given the country to you because dread of you has fallen upon us. And all the inhabitants of the land are quaking before you. We heard how the Lord dried up the sea and the waters and what you did to the Amorite kings. And when we heard about it, we lost heart, and no man had any more spirit left because of you. For the Lord your God is the only God in heaven above and on earth below." So this Canaanite prostitute is the only person in the city of Jericho who is offering, in the narrative, is offering up a full-throated support of Yahweh. And then she says, "Now, since I've shown loyalty to you, you need to do right by me and protect me from your invasion, me and my family, because we know you're coming. And you need to make sure you spare us and save our lives." And so the men answered her, "We are pledged for you, even unto death. If you do not disclose this mission of ours, we will show you true loyalty when the Lord gives us the land." And so she let them down by a rope through the window, for her dwelling was on the city wall. And she said to them, "Make for the hills so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Stay there in hiding for 3 days until they return, and then go your way." But the men warned her, "We will be released from this oath which you have made us take, unless when we invade the country, you tie this length of crimson cord to the window through which you let us down." So basically, Rahab confesses to the men that she's on their side. She's supporting their Lord and their God. And they're like, "Cool, we will protect you when you come, but we have to know where you are. So this cord that you're letting us down, you have to tie it up when the battle comes and hang it from your window." Where else have we read a story where there's crimson on the outside of your house to protect you from imminent death? The Exodus story, right? The last plague and the Passover, and they paint the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and the door lintels. This is kind of a throwback. We talked about the Mosification. See, I can't even say the word I made up. The Mosification of Joshua. This is one more kind of telling a similar thread in the story. Hang this crimson cord out, and that'll be what saves you from what's to come. So as we go through the story, now Jericho was shut up tight because of the Israelites. No one could leave or enter. And the Lord said to Joshua, I will deliver Jericho and her king and her warriors into your hands. Let all your troops march around the city and complete one circuit of the city. Do this for 6 days with 7 priests carrying 7 shofars preceding the ark. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the shofars. And when a long blast is sounded on the shofar, as soon as you hear it, all the people shall give a mighty shout, and then the city wall will collapse. So God is basically telling Joshua, here's the whole battle plan. He just kind of lays it all out. And notice that it doesn't really require them, the Israelites, to do much, because the point is that it's God who's going to deliver the city, not the Israelites. The Israelites come and clean up the mess afterwards, but God is the one who's delivering. I highlighted preceding the ark so that, in the story, the Ark of the Covenant is given to Moses and the Israelites. They store the 10 Commandments in there. And as you go through, again, we keep talking about how some of these stories need to be reinterpreted with what happened later in mind. And so during the time of Saul and David and the kings, when they went into battle, they would carry the ark into battle. That was their divine image, or that was their seat of God, so that they could carry God with them into battle. Because in the Hebrew Bible, God is very much not everywhere. He's kind of isolated in certain people and in certain places. It's not really until you get to the story of Pentecost in the New Testament where you get this outflowing of the Holy Spirit, and everybody now, God is kind of this omnipresent God flowing through everyone. But it's kind of a different mindset. So they're carrying this out in front of them as one of their battle cries. And most scholars would say that in the time of the kings, when the Israelites would go to battle, they most likely would carry their sacred object with them. And whether they, and so they're kind of casting that knowledge back into the story. And if you don't know what a shofar is, it's a long ram's horn. And they blow in the horn, and it's all hollowed out. I can't make the sound, but it's kind of a long, I think about the Ricola commercials, with the guys on the mountain with the big long horns, kind of a similar type thing. So most of the translations would say, I had to go back in and take out ram's horn and put in shofar. So, but that's what and they used it as signaling. It has a ritual presence too. It does, things ritualistically, but very, very well identified with Judaism.
Scott,
yes?
could be why we wear a cross today.
Why we wear a cross today?
That could be to lead us into war for the world. God to be with us.
Yeah, we like to have these kind of reminders, something, yeah.
The Spirit.
Right. Yeah. So, religious jewelry, religious iconography, the whole idea is that you have, the presence of God. So there's a very careful line that as Christians we try to talk about, that God isn't actually, that the image isn't actually God. It's a representation of God. But in the Old Testament, it was actually where God was at the time. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the story and where the Philistines captured the ark, right? And they put it in their temple with their God, and they kept coming in the morning. The priests come in, and their God's fallen over, and the God's head gets chopped off, and so it's kind of showing that the Israelite God, Yahweh, is much more powerful than the other gods. But this is where in the Old Testament times they kind of viewed it slightly differently. But you're right, I think it's the same idea, is you have some kind of a representation or icon that helps you understand and know that God is there with you. Okay, so Joshua gets the plan from Yahweh. He summons the priests and he says to them, take up the ark. and get 7 priests to carry 7 shofars and precede the ark of the Lord and have them out in front of the ark. So they brought the ark out and they go around the city and they did one whole circuit of the city. And then Joshua arose early the next day and the priests took the ark of the Lord and they circled the city. And you notice there's 7 priests, there's 7 days of creation. There's 7 shofars, there's 7 days of creation. They circle it for 6 days, and on the 7th day, that's in ancient times to the ancient Israelites, that number 7 showed the sign. It was kind of a number of Yahweh. It showed completeness. Everything was done in that time. There's a lot of things in a lot of symbolism often in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament for that matter, about various numbers. 12 tribes of Judah, 12 disciples. There's a lot of kind of connections between these numbers that have religious significance. Okay, so the priests go out with the horns and the ark, and they go around the city, and they do it for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, they rose at daybreak and marched around the city in the same manner, went 7 times, or this time they went 7 times around. And on the 7th time, the priests blew the horns as Joshua had commanded them and said, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and everything in it are to be proscribed." That's a weird word. I think I always skipped over that word, but we're going to talk a lot about this word. They shall be proscribed for the Lord. Only Rahab and her family are to be spared, but you must be aware of that which is prescribed, or else you will be prescribed. If you take anything from that which is prescribed, you will cause the camp of Israel to be proscribed. You will bring calamity upon us. All the silver and the gold and the objects of copper and iron are consecrated to the Lord, and they must go into the treasury of the Lord. So basically he's saying you can't loot the city for your own personal gain. When you go to the city, you have to follow all the rules. That's what we'll talk about prescribed here in a minute. You have to follow all the rules, and regardless of whether it's you think it's right or wrong, and whatever we capture goes to the treasury of the house of the Lord. It's sacred. So when the people heard the sound of the shofar, they raised a mighty shout, and the walls came tumbling down. One of the famous, there's so many songs and music and everything about walls tumbling down. And the people rushed into the city, every man straight in front of him, and they captured the city. And here's the rough part. They exterminated everything in the city with the sword, man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and ass. Yikes. But Joshua bade the 2 men who had spied out the land, and he said, "Go into the harlot's house, bring out the woman and all that belongs to her, as you swore to her." So the young spies went in, and they brought out Rahab and her family, and they brought her out. They brought out her whole family, and they left them outside the camp of Israel. So she was spared, but everybody else was exterminated. And just an artwork of, again, I hate to do this right before Christmas, but that's what's in the text. So what is it? And then it gets even better. And then they burned down the city and everything in it. But the silver and the gold and the objects of copper and iron were deposited into the treasury of the house of the Lord. That was handy. And only Rahab and her family were spared. She had hidden the messengers that Joshua had sent to spy. And the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. So there's some pretty horrible things that happen in here. The plan was given to Joshua by God, and when Joshua executed the plan, the Lord was pleased and was with Joshua. So I've heard a lot of people say, well, this is just an example of how ancient warfare was, and it's not that God was happy with it, but that's just kind of how things went. But that's not what the text is saying. The text is saying something different. So what does it mean to be prescribed or a prescription? It's a very technical sounding word. It sounds like you're going to CVS and I'm going to get a prescription, but you don't want this prescription, I can tell you that. It comes from a Hebrew word called harem. It's referred to the band. There's no real good word for it in English. We don't have a word, but it basically means that something has been set over and given over to God. And in practical terms, it means the things or the people that are given over to God are to be completely destroyed. Think of it this way. God wanted an offering, right? That's what the ancient Israelites thought. So you would kill the sheep, you'd put it on the fire, and you'd burn it, and you'd offer it to God. It was God's. It wasn't ours anymore. It had been given and set aside as sacred to God. And that's what they're doing. And what they're basically saying is everybody has to be killed because they've all been given over to the Lord. I don't agree with that. Let me just be clear. But that's what the idea was. This Hebrew word harem, is translated into Latin as devotio, which I think is also where we get the word devotion. So it's kind of a weird history, but it's been devoted to the Lord, and then over time, as people become devoted to the Lord, it loses the original meaning of the word, which was to be obliterated. And the Greek word, though, is anathema. That is has retained some of that same thing. If you say something is an anathema to you, it's like, I would never do that. It's never part of me. So it's basically a sacrifice to the gods. It's a sacrifice to the gods, particularly human sacrifice. And we keep coming up every now and then with these little things that are about human sacrifice. And we're going to talk about that in the spring a little bit more. This whole practice of harem or being prescribed or prescription is really important in the book of Joshua because obedience to this is a life and death matter for Israel and in the ancient world at all. So in the ancient world, there was some key things. And I'm going to say this relates to the Israelites, but it's true for whatever other people, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, whatever kingdom. This was how the ancient world viewed their relationship with their God. The land belongs to Yahweh or to the gods and has been given to the people by the gods. So it's not even their land. It's God's land. Yahweh seems to have no moral qualms about using military force to secure this land for his people because it's Yahweh's land. The gift of the land and the covenant to the Israelites sets them apart as a distinct and holy people dedicated to Yahweh. The land of Israel, in the mindset of the Old Testament, the land of Israel is for the Israelites and those people who worship Yahweh, no one else. If you want to worship somebody else, go to their land. If you want to worship the Egyptian gods, great. Get out of our country and go to Egypt and worship their gods because that's where their gods live, not here. And if you're going to refuse to do that, then we're going to kill you. The Canaanites in the Israelite view were a wicked and depraved people. That's what it says in Deuteronomy, who would lead Israel astray. Basically, if you let these Canaanites hang around here, they're going to try to get you to worship their Canaanite gods, and they're going to try to get you to do all these different things. And that will lead you into, that's what happened to the Northern Kingdom, right? If you're sitting in 600 BCE writing this for King Josiah, that's exactly what happened to the Northern Kingdom, is they worshiped the other gods. And then if they broke the covenant with God, God would cast them out of the land. God and the land are tied together. right? You can't separate them. So if God is, and that's why in the ancient world, if you got your country invaded and defeated, it was because your God had abandoned you and left. Or if you're on the winning side, your God had destroyed the other God, right? It was a matter of, they viewed everything as in this, both in the physical world, everything that was playing out in the physical world is a representation of the battles and everything that's happening in the spiritual world. Does that make sense? Israel is not alone in its use of harem. So this is the Misha Stela, and like all the great artifacts, it's in the British Museum. We really have to do a class trip to London because everything is in the British Museum. So I would love to go. I'll organize that for this summer. And this stele is from the Moabite king, which is basically a Canaanite by a different word. And they had rebelled at the time. King Omri of the northern kingdom, he's the king of the northern kingdom. He is kind of the overlord of Moab, and Misha, King Misha, rebels against Omri. And so it's the first, it's actually the first mention of an Israelite king anywhere. There's later things that are dated later that mention other kings, but this is the earliest mention of an Israelite king. But more importantly, what it says is in the stela, he rebels and he comes down into Israel and he attacks the city on a mountain, Mount Nebo, and he says, I seized Nebo and I killed all within it. This should be 4. 4, I had devoted them to Chemosh. Chemosh is the Moabite god. So what he's saying is, I came and destroyed everything because that was what my God told me to do. My God, Chemosh, is more powerful than Yahweh, right? So that's what Misha thinks. And so when he goes in, he kills everything. They just destroy it and they flatten it. This is the same kind of language that we see in Joshua. The Moabites devote, prescribe, exterminate, pick your verb there, and the inhabitants of Nebo as a sacrifice to their national god. The Israelites do the same thing in the conquest narratives. They're going in and wiping it out. So it's divinely sanctioned violence. Wow, I got through that faster than I thought. Do you guys have any questions?
I have read that Jericho had already been destroyed before Joshua came. Is that
Right.
true?
That is true. We're going to talk about that next week. There's a couple of other we won't go into as much gory detail, but they take out the city of Ai and they take out the city of, I can't remember the name of it. There's 2 other big battles that get mentioned in Joshua, and those cities in particular, archaeologists have gone back and excavated. Jericho was a walled city. Jericho's walls were toppled, but they were toppled about 500 years before this would have happened. And at the time frame, and remember the time frame is a little squishy of when, Israelites might have been coming in if there was some kind of invasion. It was uninhabited. It later, during the time of the kings, it got repopulated and rebuilt, and people were living there. So it was a big walled city at the time. When you get to about 600 or 700 BCE, and you're talking about these things getting written down, it's a big walled city again. So, and they're worshiping gods. It's a Philistine city, I think, or a settlement. It's not necessarily an Israelite settlement. So yes, it is, and that leads us down some other very interesting paths. So I don't want to I don't want to spoil next week, but we'll talk a lot about that, because the spoiler alert is there's a very strong possibility that none of this happened, that these are all just stories. And we'll talk about why scholars think that. And then that leads us to have to figure out, what do we do with this? It's one thing to say, you know what, again, to this mindset, it was a brutal time. We all look back in history, well-documented history, and say, you know, the Middle Ages, it was a brutal time. Colonial, the American expansion into the West in the 1800s, it was a brutal time. There were people, you know, you got killed, and you know, they talk about the cowboy movies. We've all seen it with John Wayne. You know, it's like the Colt 45 is what civilized the West, quote unquote. You know, it was expansion through violence, very empire centric, right? A lot of imperial mindset at that time. So we have to kind of think through that. So we'll cover that in more detail next week. But you're absolutely right, Cora, on the archaeology.
What language is that in? Is the tablet?
This is in, it's in, I want to say it's in Akkadian cuneiform. I'd have to go look. Yeah, it's not Hebrew. I know that. It's whatever the local language of the Moabites.
What tribe was Joshua?
Looks Greek. Pardon me?
What tribe was Joshua?
So I think he was a Benjaminite. I think.
When they talk about the northern kingdoms being taken over, is that when the 10 tribes were lost? Or am I mixing
Yeah,
that?
no, yeah. So the northern kingdom is actually the 11 tribes of, so there's 12 tribes of Israel, of the nation of Israel. One tribe is the tribe of Judah, which is the furthest south, and then the land just to the north of it was the tribe of Benjamin, and then all the rest of them. So you can go through all the rest of them, but everything from Benjamin north was obliterated and lost. So you hear about the lost tribes of Israel. That's the northern kingdom, who were taken away by the Assyrians.
And lost to history and the writings that came out of the Babylonian captivity.
So they're lost to history. Nobody knows what happened to them. We do know that starting around after that time, we start seeing Jewish settlements and Jewish enclaves around the ancient world. So that's known as the diaspora. You start seeing these people popping up. It's the same thing after the Babylonian exile. A lot of the Israelites were like, you know what? I'm not going back. You know, I got everything I need. They just brought in, you know, fiber optic cable into Babylon here, and I'm not going back to live in the sticks. You know, I'm going to stay right here. I'm very comfortable here, and you guys have a good time. I'm going to stay here. So, I mean, there was a lot of that. People just decided we're not going back, but they retained their Jewish identity and their Jewish heritage. And by the time you get to Jesus, and Paul in particular, there's Jewish communities all throughout the Roman Empire. And that's when we talk about Paul going out to the Gentiles, what Paul really does is he goes to these Jewish communities, this diaspora, and in these Jewish communities, they are not so strict as they are in Jerusalem about who can come and hang out with them. And so you get a lot of people who are referred to as God-fearers or God worshipers, and they're Gentiles who have not fully converted to Judaism, but they come and worship in the synagogues with the Jewish people. They follow all the food laws and they do the things, but and that's who a lot of scholars think Paul was speaking to, and they were like converting to Christianity in droves, because they're like, wait a minute, you mean I can be a full-fledged member of this sect and not have to get circumcised and not have to go through all the thing? And Paul's like, yep, come on in. But these people are contributing lots of money to the Jewish, and so the Jews, we hear that word a lot sometimes in the New Testament, in a derogatory mark. They were upset, and they were like, hey, this isn't right. You can't, and so that kicked off the whole debate in the New Testament time of should Gentiles be allowed to be Christians without first converting to Judaism? Is Christianity something new, or is it just a kind of a sect or a part of Judaism? And Paul seems to have won out in that argument that it's anybody can come in. I think Paul would have said, no, it's still part of Judaism, but it's a new part and everybody's welcome. But the rest, I don't think the rest of the Jewish people, we have stories about that in the New Testament where Paul is at odds with James and Peter, who are down in Jerusalem leading the church there. And in the New Testament, they all kind of work it all out. In the book of Acts, it's like, oh, we all got together and we had a meeting and then we all sang Kumbaya and everything was great. But you keep seeing these little mentions, if you read through the letters of Paul and some of the other epistles, of kind of some ongoing tension between this. And eventually we know that eventually the Jews were like, we don't want to have anything to do with you guys. All right, one last thought. Any other questions before we go? One last thought, and this was something really, really important that my professor said to us in our class. So I'll say it to you. I'm not saying that all of this is what God really said to the Israelites. What I'm saying is, this is what the Israelites said that God said to them. So we have to remember the perspective from which we're reading. And I think that's where, if you've got the view, kind of a modern, I say modern, but it's been there a lot. But if your view is everything is exactly true and comes right out of the mouth of God, you really have a difficult time dealing with these passages. I don't subscribe to that. I think that's a step of faith, that you're making a faith statement about what the Bible is. Because if you say it's all word for word exactly what God wanted us to say, then my argument would be, well, in what language and in which version of the text and which version of the document, and why don't we have the original versions anymore? And so there's a whole lot of this. So I think you kind of have to then view it. If it's not that, it's and we can still say it's inspired. That people were inspired to write this because of their faith. But it becomes much more of a text of they're trying to tell us something. This is what the Israelites said that God said to them. And I think that really helped me process some of this stuff. And we'll talk a bit more about that next week, in the next 2 weeks. But I do want to have, we made a few jokes today, but this is serious stuff. And it really can derail your faith, and I don't want that to happen. And it can lead to some really bad theology and bad views of God that I think Jesus worked really, really hard to counter these kinds of things. So we have to recognize that this is coming from a perspective, and that perspective, the Bible has multiple perspectives. And there's other places in the Hebrew Bible, even in the Old Testament, where other writers disagree with this. The book of Job is a whole argument against this kind of thinking. There's a whole group of Psalms that argue against this Deuteronomistic retributional theology. They're like, no, that's not how it works. So what you're seeing is a debate. The prophets argue against this. Jeremiah talks about human sacrifice. Remember, we talked about that a few weeks ago. And God comes to Jeremiah and says, what are you thinking? I would have never, ever asked you to sacrifice children. But you asked us to wipe out a whole city of Canaanites in Jericho. So there's different viewpoints, different mindsets, and there's a bit of debate. And in my mind, I think that's where Jesus comes in when we get to that part in the spring. When Jesus comes in, is he's trying to he's reinterpreting, and he's taking the passages that are in the Old Testament of taking care of people, loving your neighbor. All of the things Jesus preaches isn't revolutionary because it's all in the Old Testament. But what he's doing is he's taking that and he's putting that as more important than this theology of do it this way or else we're going to kill you. So I hope that helps a little bit. All right. Have a great week. Thank you for coming out in the rain, and we'll see you next week.